Hi, I'm Lauri Haapanen, and this is what I ate for lunch today at around 11 o'clock. However, what if a researcher came up to me and asked me to describe my typical lunchtime habits? What should I say? Describing this snack is not a good answer, because yesterday I ate sushi at 12 o'clock. The day before I ate much earlier, and sometimes I don't have time to eat at all, or I just eat some leftovers from the fridge at home. Perhaps I would just say something like, I usually eat lunch around noon and eat something relatively cheap and hopefully tasty or at least healthy. Such a formulation would be a rough estimate, and most likely it just describes what I would like to eat or have eaten lately, or what I want to tell others that I eat. Okay, this presentation is not about my lunch habits. Instead, in this presentation, I want to question the dominant status of simplistic interview methods in the academic world. And I'm not saying that, for example, semi-structured interviews don't have a place. Of course they do. They work very well when applied to one-off and easy-to-remember events, such as winning the lottery or having an accident. But as applied researchers, we are often interested in everyday processes that have become routine and repetitive, but don't take place in exactly the same way every time. And approaching such daily processes by asking simplistic questions presents the problem that I wanted to illustrate with my lunch photos. And the problem is that presenting general questions about everyday processes is as if the researcher were outsourcing the task of generalization to the informant, who then does it without following any consistent methodological procedure. So let me now present two solutions to overcome this problem. They are drawn from my own field, media linguistics. The first solution takes us to Switzerland, where a research team wanted to find out how the Swiss public service TV stations succeeded in fulfilling their mandate to promote public understanding. Naturally, this question was so abstract and vague that the research team couldn't just pop into a newsroom and ask the first journalist they met, "What are your best practices to promote public understanding?" That wouldn't have worked. Therefore, they needed to combine ethnographic observation to find out what journalists do and an interview method to know why they do it. One option for that could have been a think aloud protocol, where a researcher would have sat down next to the journalist and asked him to say out loud what his thinking was while writing. However, since writing is a highly verbal activity, the methods for verbalization that take place during the process of writing would most likely have interrupted and distorted the writing flow. So the Swiss researchers needed a method of verbalization that would be performed afterwards, and their answer was a cue-based retrospective verbalization. To begin with, the researchers installed a screenshot recording program that ran behind the journalist's text editor and recorded all his screen activities, for example keystrokes, mouse movements, and pauses while writing. Then, immediately after completing the writing, the journalist watched on the screen how his texts came into being, and while doing so, he continuously commented on what he was doing when writing and why he was doing it. In this way, the cue-based retrospective verbalization opens a window onto the journalist's mind and reveals his thinking and decision-making. The cue-based retrospective verbalization can be considered a state-of-the-art method when studying relatively short writing tasks, such as the production of a television news item, which takes only a few hours. But with longer tasks, this method could be problematic because, as a researcher, you can't record and ask the journalist to watch a production process that might take days, weeks, or even months. And this is the very challenge that is present in my current research project, which investigates journalistic writing for written publications, such as newspapers, magazines, and various online platforms. I couldn't exploit a cue-based retrospective verbalization per se, as described on the previous slides, because producing pieces of written journalism can take a really long time. So I needed to adapt the method to find some other way to document the production process extensively. And for this purpose, I turned my focus to quoting, because the process of quoting seems to affect the whole production. I worked out a model whose basic idea is that journalists and their editorial teams first decide on a topical issue to be addressed, and at the same time reject other topics. Then the journalists identify groups of people who are somehow linked to this topical issue, such as victims, authorities, laypeople, or politicians, and bring these groups into the emerging news item, but most likely not all of them. Thirdly, the journalists pick out some people as representatives of these societal groups. And finally, they might quote these representatives. In the gathering of retrospective verbalizations, I used this model in this way. I met a journalist right after he had finished his manuscript. And this brand new manuscript as a stimulus, we walked through the production process, and I asked the journalist to explain why he had selected that topic and subtopics, why he had selected those societal groups, those representatives, and those quotes. In this way, I managed to produce a data corpus in which the journalists described their mental activities during the production process. To sum up, ethnographic observation captures practitioners' actual activities, but it leaves it to researcher to interpret their intentions. An interview-based inquiry, in turn, allows researchers to access practitioners' mental reflections on their work, but is constrained by their self-awareness. So, to overcome the potential validity problems in applied research, we need methods that combine both ethnographic observation and interviews. For further discussion, please take a look at my hot off the press paper, which puts forward a new kind of approach using data triangulation to overcome the methodological challenges that might arise in our research.